Okay. So on the Part 91 document that I put in here, the only ones I even put in here are ones that we need to deal with. I know if you've ever looked at the FARs, there's hundreds in every one of these sections, Part 91, and all those other sections that I listed, like in the video, like Part 1 with all the definitions, Part 25 with all the airworthiness specifications. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we don't have to know it necessarily as dispatchers. There's just a lot of stuff that we need just to know where to find it. So you kind of have that different mix with the FARs. There's ones that you need to know, that you need to memorize, that we're going to really focus on today, and the stuff that I circled in the red boxes. And then there's the stuff that you just kind of need to know where to find it. So with all the stuff that we've been looking at, if you want to really just filter down the FARs, just being able to memorize, like you just need to know that if you need to look up a word or know a definition, that's going to be in Part 1. That's as much as you need to know about Part 1. I mean, if you look at Part 1, it's like 200 pages long by itself. So Part 25, only thing you need to know about that is just that that's mostly maintenance, and those people, they're the ones that kind of have to know Part 25, because that's all of your airworthiness specifications for transport category airplanes for airlines to kind of abide by. In dispatch, we don't have to look at any of that stuff. Like, we don't, we're not involved in that kind of stuff. So we just need to know that that's where it is, that's it. The only ones that we really care about, that we spend most of our time in, are going to be the ones. So on day one of the whole course, 4 or 5 weeks ago, we covered Part 65. And really the only thing that you guys even need to know in Part 65 is just simply the stuff that we kind of, that was already on the quiz anyway, but like, you got to be 23 years old to be a dispatcher. You got to take a course like this, or or be a pilot, or get your pilot's license. I mean, or have some combination of experience and schooling or whatever. Obviously, everyone in here is doing the course, so there's that stuff that you need to know. But really, other than just knowing that you got to be 23 years of age, you got to be able to read and write and speak English, and you have to, take some sort of a course, get a license. The rest of it that talks about what the course has to have, I mean, you guys don't really even need to know that. So that's really the only thing in Part 65 is just the qualifications for becoming a dispatcher, is all that really is. Once you start kind of getting up the road into the stuff we really care about, there's a few things in Part 91, which is the ones I have up right here. So Part 91 is going to just deal with the basic operating rules for airplanes in general. So I know most of you guys have probably heard, like when we operate a repo flight, or if we're operating some sort of a, anything that's not a passenger carrying flight, revenue passenger, we refer to it usually as a Part 91 flight, right? Part 91 is just your general aviation. They have totally different rules. I know for you guys in crew support, we treat every, for pilot legality stuff, we obviously treat everything as if it's 121. But technically, if they wanted to get down to the nitty-gritty, a pilot could fly his full 8 hours or 9 hours on the 121. They do the deadheads and stuff, right? Yeah.
The Brazil, I like.
Oh yeah. They go off of 121 still? They don't.
They wouldn't be basically illegal.
No, you have to sit there and it lights up for us the entire week.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, because it's still tracking them, showing that they got assigned to the Brazil to Manaus to, anyway. Yeah. So, yeah, so, yeah, I guess, I mean, for software tracking purposes, obviously they're not going to change our software to track specifically Part 91 stuff, but technically, if we really kind of got down to the real rules, like we could have a pilot fly the entire day and go his full 9 hours of block, and then once he got done, we could still have him do a repo. I mean, as long as it's Part 91. The only thing that I know in the FARs that it states is that if we have him do a repo before he flies, then we have to consider it
Yes.
as
Part 1.
scheduled duty. But if it's after his scheduled duty, then we don't have to consider it. So anyway, so Part 91, let's dive into this. This is really just kind of more your primary rules. And we're only looking at the ones that you would ever care about as a dispatcher. So first and foremost is aircraft speed. So this is something that you'll just know as a dispatcher, but it's something you want to start off just knowing and, you know, kind of have it memorized. But this is basically, and a lot of these, I'm not going to read a lot of these verbatim, you know, because the more you read these, the more it just screws up your head. So basically all you need to know in this one is that if you are below 10,000 feet, you cannot exceed 250 knots indicated airspeed. That's all it is. I know that's an ADX question. I don't know if you guys have seen it like in your reviewing of stuff.
Yeah, I think so.
So anyway, just know that. The only other time, so there's, when somebody gives you this question or if you get asked this question, in reality, it's not like this question really ever even comes up for a dispatcher or this whole rule even plays a factor in your flight planning, because it doesn't. The only time you ever really see any of this is really on the ADX, or maybe if you're getting quizzed like in recurrent or something like that, or on your practical, you just might see that question like, what's the max speed if I'm under 10,000 feet? You just have to know it's 250. And the only exception or the only change to that is that if you are in or if you are underneath Class Bravo airspace. Okay? If you remember, if any of you guys can remember back to like the PowerPoint presentations for airspace design, Class B is like an upside down wedding cake is what they refer to it as. So when you look at it from the top or from the profile view, I guess, it just looks like that, you know. So it's kind of like going like an upside down wedding cake. So if you happen to be flying, let's say if you're flying a plane, but you're not necessarily, let's say you're underneath that top tier, but you're still not in Class Bravo. So if you're underneath it though, then the max speed is only 200. That's the only exception to this rule. Otherwise, it's 250 knots under 10,000 feet. So you might get posed that question, you know, not from me necessarily, but, you know, from in your FAA practical exam or whatever. Like it might just be a combination question of what's the max speed under 10,000 feet, 250 knots. What if, are there any exceptions to that rule? Or what if I'm in Class Bravo or underneath Class Bravo? Well, then the only exception is just that then it changes to 200. That's it though. The next one. The next one is just talking about IFR flight plans. This is saying, unless otherwise authorized by air traffic control, each person filing an IFR flight plan must include the following information. Now, when it refers to IFR, remember there's the two different types of flight plans. There's VFR and there's IFR. Now, for your guys' care and concern, it's all IFR. It's everything we file is IFR. So we do not file anything but IFR. Dispatchers never will, never have. So for all your purposes of this particular FAR, just know that everything you do will be IFR flight plans. So regardless of the weather, we always file IFR. So okay, so this particular FAR is talking about what we refer to as the 1, 2, 3 rule. Okay, has anyone ever heard that thrown out? The 1, 2, 3 rule. Aaron has. The 1, 2, 3 rule. If you were to say that there is one single most thing that you need to know as a dispatcher, probably the very top of that list is going to be this rule, the 1, 2, 3 rule. Okay, and the 1, 2, 3 rule determines whether or not you need an alternate. Okay, so literally you use this particular FAR/rule on every flight that you dispatch. Every release that you look at and plan and prepare, every single one of those you're going to be using the 1, 2, 3 rule, because on every single one of those, when you go to look at your destination weather and you're looking at the forecast for your estimated time of arrival, you're going to be using the 1, 2, 3 rule to determine whether or not you need an alternate. Okay, so the rule is like this. Well, let me read how it says it in here first, and then we'll kind of just explain it further. But it says, for aircraft other than helicopters, so that's hopefully makes sense, for at least 1 hour before and for 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival, the ceiling at the destination airport will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport elevation, and the visibility will be at least 3 statute miles. So that's where you get your 1, 2, 3. The 1 is just meaning 1 hour before, 1 hour after. The 2 means 2,000 foot ceiling, and then the 3 is 3 statute miles visibility. So if we are arriving, and let's see, what I will also do here is bring up I'm going to bring up our weather portal here real quick. Is everyone in here comfortable with the text weather formats, ATARs, TAFs, how we read them, how we decode them? You're going to be seeing a ton of them, so we're going to be, if you don't feel comfortable now, you will definitely feel comfortable after we start doing flight plans. But let's just take a look at, let's just take a look at Denver. The thing I want to look at is the TAF and the METAR. Okay, so let's see if I can bring it up on the PDF. Okay. Let's say that now remember, everything with with the weather forecast, everything, and for dispatch in general, is always going to be in Zulu UTC time. So let's just say that our ETA, we're planning a flight to Denver, and our ETA is 0500 Zulu. So if we're planning that flight, we're going to look at the current Denver TAF, the forecast, and we're going to know in our heads that, okay, we're supposed to arrive there at 500 Zulu. And we go to the line here that corresponds, and it says at that time in Denver the wind will be, or should be, 190 at 11 knots. The visibility, that P, so it says P6SM. So the P just means greater than. That's all that means. And the best visibility that you will ever see in a TAF will be P6SM. It does not, they don't list anything higher than 6. So if it just says P6, that just means greater than 6. That's the best possible viz you can see in a TAF. Just like in a METAR, the best viz you'll ever see is 10. You'll never see anything higher unless you're going to Canada or Mexico or somewhere European. But for our sake, the best you'll ever see is 10 in the United States. In a METAR, and then in a TAF will be 6. So it's greater than 6 statute miles, and then the cloud conditions, sky condition, is saying few at 14,000 feet and broken at 22,000 feet. So there's a couple of different things we have to talk about with this one. So does anybody remember what the definition of a ceiling is? Cloud ceiling. The lowest level of broken or overcast, yeah. So now with regards to the 1, 2, 3 rule, the 1, 2, 3 rule is stating that the ceiling needs to be 2,000 or better, right? So in this case, what's the ceiling at 500 Zulu in Denver? 22,000, right? Because the few at 14,000 is not a ceiling. The only thing that would ever be a ceiling is just broken or overcast. So the BKN acronym and the OVC acronym when you see it. So the ceiling in Denver at our time of arrival is 22,000 feet. So obviously that's 20,000 feet better than we need. So the only other thing we're looking at here, and then the visibility obviously is greater than 6. So that just needs to be 3 or higher, and then the ceiling needs to be 2,000 or higher. So the only other thing that we look at when we're doing this is we need to go 1 hour before and 1 hour after. So 1 hour before 5Z would be 4Z, obviously, right? So the 4Z, now it doesn't necessarily have a line for 400 Zulu in this TAF, right? So the most previous line is going back to 2 Zulu. So when it says in these, and this is just kind of a recap of how a forecast, how a TAF works, but when it says from 2Z, that means that this weather is expected to be what it says here all the way until the next from line. And so you know that on a from line, it's the ones that start with FM at the beginning. So when it says FM at the beginning, that means that it's indicating that it is a new forecast or a new, forecasted conditions. So the 4Z hour technically falls in this 2Z line, because the 2Z line is valid from 2 all the way until 4:59 Zulu. And then this one, since it's at 5Z, starts at 5Z, and this one goes, this is saying that these conditions are expected to maintain themselves all the way until 14 Zulu. So 9 hours here. So this one was just 3 hours. But anyway, so the hour before is 4Z, so it's going to fall into this column. And if we look at this one, we have to make sure that now in this one that our that we have all of the 1, 2, 3 rule, that we comply with it here. So still got greater than 6 statute miles, few at 8,000, scattered at 14,000, and then still broken 22,000. So we have our viz better than 3, and we have our ceiling better than 2,000. So we're good on this one. So the hour before, we're good. And now the hour after, if you go back to your 5Z, so 6Z would be our hour after. So it still technically is just going to be this line, because this next line after it doesn't technically start until 14. So this one line is going to be our hour after, you know, the line that's valid for the hour after, as well as the exact ETA. So between the 2Z and the 5Z line, we cover our hour before and hour after. Does that kind of make sense, how we're looking at this? I'm going to bring up some other TAFs and hopefully some other ones that have some like tempo remarks in them so that we can look at these a little bit more. But so this flight, you know, the flight that we're trying to plan going to Denver, based on a 5Z arrival, does not need an alternate. The other thing about this particular rule, and it's kind of something that the FAA inspector people kind of like to. This specific one, I guess, for SkyWest, his name is Jeff Gilmer, but he likes to always kind of like be a little tricky as far as the way he asked this question. The rule of the 1, 2, 3 rule is technically he'll ask you a question that'll say like, when does a flight need an alternate? Right, and then you're thinking, your immediate thinking is the 1, 2, 3 rule, right? But a flight, the way that the FAA and the FARs are wording this particular rule is that a flight always needs an alternate unless the 1, 2, 3 rule conditions exist. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
You always need an alternate unless you can comply with 1, 2, 3. With the 1, 2, 3 rule.
I'm
Yeah.
just going to say, when I interviewed back in November, while I was interviewing my license, Bill asked me that, and that's when I said, always, except, and he's like, great answer.
Yeah.
So when you guys interview, make sure you say that.
Yeah. Exactly. So and that's really just because the FAA inspectors kind of use it as like a gotcha type question, you know? Not that they really ever harp on it too much, but they will ask you, that is the way you are expected to answer that question. It's, when does a flight need an alternate? The default answer is always unless we have greater than 3 statute or greater than a 2,000 foot ceiling, an hour, you know, unless 1 hour before, 1 hour after, greater than 2,000 foot ceiling, and greater than 3 statute miles visibility. So, but a lot of people will obviously say, well, it only needs one if, you know, they'll say it the other way. But anyway, it's just kind of a stupid little side note, but just know that in case you do get the question. Always needs an alternate unless the 1, 2, 3 rule applies. Let's take a look at our radar here real quick. Just want to see what parts of the country might require an alternate. Good weather chart to look at for this particular thing is, let's see, where is it? Our surface analysis chart. Let's look at the weather depiction chart here. Ceilings. Okay. So looks like our best bet would be somewhere in the northwest. So let's look at Seattle. Let's look at Portland, Spokane. Let's just see what we got with those. TAFs, meter, TAFs. course, none of them.
Yeah, we did have good weather today.
Yeah.
San Fran blow, that was it.
So what we'll maybe do then is let's look at the California coast for tonight. That might be a little bit better. Maybe even, let's look at Monterey too. Okay, there we go. Okay, so LA. Let's say we have a flight arriving to LA same time, 5Z. Does anybody want to take a crack at it?
It's 1,700 feet for the overcast, so it wouldn't work out. You need an alternate there.
So yeah, so 5Z. What if we have a flight arriving into LA at 5Z? What line is going to be our valid forecast line in the TAF? 3Z, correct? And what's our conditions at 3Z? So do we need an alternate?
Yes.
Because of?
Under 60,000.
Correct. Yeah. So as of 3Z, we have a 1,700 foot broken ceiling in LA. So yeah, it would need an alternate in this case. So that's good. So this one, let's take a look at San Luis Obispo.
When you're looking for that alternate, do they have to be the purple ones you be doing?
Not necessarily, no. Alternate minimums, which we'll look at in conjunction with the FARs and then the op specs, they have a little bit of a different parameter. And so there's a specific FAR that it's a rule. We call it the 1 NAV, 2 NAV rule, which is something you guys will have to basically memorize. But it's basically figuring out, it's a way of figuring out your alternate minimums, so on whether it's legal to use or not. But we'll look at it. Right now it'll probably be more confusing to even talk about because it just will, it's a kind of a doozy as far as remembering all of the specifics to it. But yeah, generally speaking, yes, they don't have to comply with the 1, 2, 3 rule specifically, but there is a different rule that they do have to comply with. So the 1, 2, 3 rule is simply just for the destination. It is just for your destination and whether your destination needs an alternate. That's it. So San Luis Obispo, let's see, a flight arriving at 9 Zulu. Yeah, so what is our ceiling for a 9Z arrival? 600 technically, right? It's it's the lowest layer. And so only broken and overcast are considered ceiling layers. So yeah, so 600 feet would be our ceiling. So what about a flight arriving at 2Z?
You'd be fine, right, if you had 15,000? Or do you use the one?
Yeah, 2Z.
Well, no, because an hour after.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for, yeah. Your hour after. Yep. Yeah, so if you're at 2Z, then you got to do your hour after is going to be 3Z, which will be, so your ETA of 2Z is fine, and your hour before 2Z is fine, but your hour after will be the one that makes you require the alternate. Okay, so how about an arrival? What if our arrival was at 1845 Zulu?
Oh, yeah.
An hour before, be 1200.
Yeah, the hour before would be 1745, which would put it in the 1530 from line, which has the broken 1200-foot ceiling. So yeah, I mean, yeah, so you got to just make sure the biggest thing on the 1, 2, 3 rule, honestly, I mean, because you end up kind of training your eyes to look for like the numbers of like 3 or less, and then like you end up training your eyes to look at broken and overcast. So it really, like, you'll be really surprised on like how good you get with just like your ability to quickly scan a TAF and just like have those things, like they just like boom, they stick out like they're printed in red. Like it'll be the same thing with NOTAMs and a lot of like MELs and things like that. When you go, you'll end up seeing stuff so much and training your eyes so much on where to look and what to look for that like those things that are like your trigger items just end up standing out. Like you'd be surprised. Like at the beginning when you start dispatching, like every dispatcher that's new and training and is out there on the floor, like they spend like 5 minutes looking at every single TAF. And it obviously takes you a lot longer at the beginning to do a full release than it does. And then some people, I mean, not to say that later on, a lot of people end up just getting complacent and kind of like, ooh, yeah, no, and then they totally miss something. But like if you can really get fast at like looking and just like having it stand out, like, and just because you're looking, I mean, if you think about it, every release you do, you will look at a TAF for your destination. You'll do the 1, 2, 3 rule on every single release. Whether you use it or not, obviously, is different, but since you're using it, I mean, you do it 50 times a day at least, right? So let's take a look at San Diego. Okay, let's see. Arriving San Diego at, let's say we're getting in at 1 Zulu.
So is the 2000 like 2000 included in it, or is it like 19 like 59?
So the rule is it's 1 hour before or after. It's 2,000 feet or better.
Or better.
Or better. And then 3 miles
So
or
if
higher.
it's 2000, then that's fine.
If it's right at 2,000, then it does not need an alternate. Yeah, 1900 would be your first. Yeah. Because you'll never see it listed, obviously, as like 1980 or 19. It'll always be in hundreds. So 1900 would be the highest one that would for sure require. Now, if it's at 2,000, right on the money 2,000, right, and the next TAF shows it with a ceiling, it's very possible that you still might put an alternate on that flight anyway.
Okay.
You know, just because one of the biggest things that probably bothers dispatchers that'll kind of get you as a dispatcher is a forecast change after you've done the release. So you're responsible, as a dispatcher, you're responsible for whether or not like it needs an alternate basically all the way up until they send their manifest numbers. So basically you're talking, in most cases, they usually, I mean, most pilots by policy, SkyWest policy, they're supposed to do their manifest before they leave the gate, before they trigger an out time. Most of them still just do it after they leave the gate, you know, but the point of dispatch is what they call it, right? So you are responsible for amending a release or changing it or following on whether it needs an alternate or not, all the way up until the point of dispatch. And the point of dispatch is the moment when the pilot sends his manifest or his takeoff numbers, when he's putting it into the ACARS. We can obviously bring it up on the ACARS log and we can see it. those of you guys that get on there sometimes looking, for the non-movement stuff, when you see the columns that say takeoff data, like there's usually a bunch of them, that's basically them running their manifest. So on the ACARS log, there's a little thing that says POD, and that means point of dispatch. So if the TAF changed before the point of dispatch, then that release, if it changed like to needing an alternate, let's say that 130 Zulu line changed to broken 1500 instead of the broken 2000. Well, now your flight does need an alternate based on the TAF. And if that happened to change, and you can see the timestamp of the TAF right there. So this timestamp on the San Diego TAF says 08Z, or sorry, 08 is the day. So 8th of June at 23:39 Zulu. So your point of dispatch, if your point of dispatch was 23:35 Zulu, then it wouldn't, if there was an amended TAF that needed an alternate, but it came out after the point of dispatch, then you're okay. But if it came out before the point of dispatch, then your flight at that point is not legal. And that's kind of one of the biggest items that'll get you. Even though you've sent the release, you need to go back and monitor those destinations until you're monitoring them all the time regardless, but you specifically need to watch your weather reports so that they don't, especially on ones that are right on the border. That's why a lot of people will just put an alternate on a flight like this. The forecast is literally the absolute minimum that's not requiring an alternate on the ceiling. So a lot of them will just put it on there because the trend for San Diego is that it will have a ceiling later. So because of the trend, and then not wanting to kind of get caught with their pants down, they'll sometimes just put an alternate on this to start with, you can put an alternate. You don't. The 1, 2, 3 rule is like the black and white. Does it need an alternate or not? However, you can put an alternate on a flight anytime you want, regardless of the 1, 2, 3 rule. The 1, 2, 3 rule will make it required, from a legality standpoint, if it's less than a 2,000 foot ceiling or 3 miles visibility. But that doesn't mean that if you have better weather that you can't put an alternate on. A lot of people kind of get into the habit of oh, it doesn't need an alternate, so I'm not going to put one. Well, there's a lot of different reasons that you'd put an alternate, not just weather, right? A lot of them NOTAMs for closures of runways. Thunderstorms is a really good example because thunderstorms are pretty much unforecastable, I guess, if you want to call that. You'll see them in a forecast, but thunderstorms are so unpredictable that even if you do see them in a forecast, it's usually not accurate. So, Denver's obviously going to be probably one of the better examples of a city that gets unforecasted thunderstorms. You start to expect them just simply due to the timing of the year and just the nature of how Denver operates. But if you were to look at a forecast for Denver on any given morning, usually you're not going to see thunderstorms forecasted for the afternoon. But this time of year, almost every day in the afternoon, you still get thunderstorms in Denver, even though they're not in the forecast. And that's just simply because the models that they use for forecasts can't predict thunderstorms. But if you're a person who has a lot of experience dispatching to Denver, usually you just know that if your flight is arriving in the early to mid, late afternoon, anytime in that time frame, that you normally will add extra fuel, potentially add an alternate, even though the TAF is VFR, the whole day. So you'll find that there's a lot of those types of situations, but you can add an alternate whenever you want if you think, as the dispatcher, if you think that you want one or need one. So yeah, you want to be able to justify the reason. Obviously, you just don't, by that reasoning, people would just put an alternate on every flight just to blanket cover, themselves. But it means, have a reason, have a good justification, because if it requires an alternate, or if it doesn't require one per the 1, 2, 3 rule and you add one, then the requirement is that you need to put a remark on the release as to why you added it. Because a crew will see it, and then they'll see that the weather doesn't require it, and then it'll make them like wonder, like, well, why, is there something else I need to know about? That, so you need to put the remark that basically says, this is why I added an alternate, potential thunderstorms that are unforecasted, or any other reason too, like, like VIP movement is a really good one, right? VIP movement of like when, the president or any other, high government executive authority, whatever, is arriving or leaving an airport, they basically shut down the airport for 30, 40 minutes, and they always will estimate this is when we think he's going to come and go, but it's usually never on schedule, right? So if you're going into an airport that has planned VIP movement, if we have an ETA anywhere from like an hour before to an hour after when they say it's supposed to happen, we add like 30 minutes of hold fuel on every flight going into that airport, just because they literally shut down the airport and make everybody hold until that plane takes off and gets out of there, or lands and gets in, and then they exit the plane, walk out, and basically get off of the secure area. So but there's a lot of different reasons. So you can add it for VIP movement, unforecasted weather that you think is going to happen. You can add it for if there's like another really good example is we have a lot of cities, like Reno is a really good example of a city that has a lot of wind shear problems, a lot of crosswind. And so wind, obviously, the 1, 2, 3 rule doesn't include anything about wind, right? So if you could be greater than 6 statute miles, skies clear in your TAF, but your wind could be 280 at 50, forecasted. And so if your runway is like 3.4 or 3.5, 3.6, if you're thinking about the heading of the runway, and then if it's a crosswind forecasted, wind at your estimated time of arrival that's really strong, now it's another really good reason of why you would add an alternate is due to crosswinds, because you can't land if you get in there and it's really blowing at 50 miles per hour in a crosswind. We cannot land in that much of a crosswind. So our max is 25 to 30 knots. So that's another good example. There's a lot of airports we go to that have those situations. So there's a lot of airports we fly to, not a lot, there's a handful of airports we fly to that just because of the nature of the airport, it requires an alternate always. And that's really just due to the limited availability of like instrument approaches and things like that at the airport. Palm Springs is a really interesting airport because the only approach that they have available, they have no ILS, none of the approaches that you guys have looked at already. They don't have, the only type of approach, instrument approach they have is a circling approach. So if Palm Springs, if the forecast, and granted, Palm Springs is almost always good weather. It's obviously similar to St. George, right? It's really rare that St. George needs an alternate. Same deal with probably even less rare, or even more rare, I should say, with Palm Springs. But if Palm Springs requires an alternate, the flight is not even legal to send it. So if you're dispatching a plane to Palm Springs and you see broken 1900, overcast 1900, the flight can't even go at all. So that's kind of another airport that will kind of get dispatchers. It's gotten me a time or two at least, but it's not even legal because, and we'll get into the legality of sending flights later, but in order to send a flight, the TAF has to, there's a couple of things you're looking at. There's stuff like the 1, 2, 3 rule, which is whether you need an alternate or not. Then there's other rules that, is the flight legal to even send at all? Like once you get down to like really bad weather, whatever instrument approach you plan on using at the time of arrival, the TAF has to say in it that at your ETA, it will have those weather minimums in, expected. If it has less than the minimums of the instrument approach that you plan to use, then the flight is not legal to launch at all. So I know you guys in crew support have seen that, where we say the flight's not even legal to send.
Yeah.
There's the needing of an alternate, which is one thing, but then there's is it even legal to go at all? So for most airports that we go to, we can go all the way down to a half mile, and in some of the big hub airports, we can go down to a quarter mile, because the instrument approach availability of what we're planning on using, in some places we can go down to Cat 2, we can go down to quarter mile, 1200 RVR, but at least in the majority of our airports, we can at least go down to a half mile. So once you start getting down below half mile, it's questionable as to whether the flight's even legal to send. Now, except for Palm Springs. Palm Springs, because the only instrument approach there is a circling approach, the weather minimums are 2,000 feet ceiling and 3 statute miles visibility. So if you have less than that, which those are just happen to be the exact 1, 2, 3 rule, if Palm Springs needs an alternate, then it's not even legal. So if you're adding an alternate to Palm Springs, you should, it should, based on weather. If you're adding it because the TAF needs an alternate, then that should be a trigger to that it's not even legal to go at all. So anyway, just a little fun fact. Okay. Okay, so Santa Barbara, let's look at that one because it has a tempo remark. So the one thing that when you have a TAF, so going back now, this is the first one we've looked at here that has a tempo remark right here. So a tempo remark just means, it's a temporary condition that's expected to exist between, and in this case, 4Z to 9Z. Okay. Now, when you look at this, so if you look at the from lines, right, now the from lines actually indicate a new forecast. When you have a tempo remark, it is not considered a new forecast. So if I were to say that my estimated time of arrival into Santa Barbara is, let's say it's at 8 Zulu. Would this need an alternate? So here's another question. I think the only place even in the Santa Barbara TAF is not Cleartail 14Z that anything needs an alternate anyway. So it's kind of a dumb question to even ask. But let's just say this. If I'm arriving at 8 Zulu into Santa Barbara, what is my expected forecasted wind at my estimated time of arrival? Stupid flies all over me over here. So that's what you would think based on the way we've been looking at the other TAFs, right? But really, so it's the tempo remarks only are for that exact time. So that's kind of why I wanted to show you this. So if you are at 8Z, it's technically outside of this tempo, right? It's after the tempo, I should say. But it's still before the next line, right? Because the next line starts at 10Z, but it's not inside of this tempo. So if you think about it, if your ETA is inside of the tempo, then the tempo is what you look at. If your ETA is outside of that, then you actually revert back to the line, the previous from line.
So you're keeping basically the sky conditions from the previous and then just applying the wind speed conditions from the tempo?
Exactly, yeah. So it's saying that in this tempo remark, the only thing that's expected to temporarily change is just the wind. So, what's that?
potentially, like, it could have everything else in it though. Like, it could have different ceilings or different sections.
Yeah, so everything, so from 9, so if you look at it this way, from 4Z until 10Z, these are your expected conditions, except for during this 3-hour period here, the wind is expected to change to this. But it's supposed to, once that ends though, it's expected to revert back to this until 10. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just want to make sure, because the tempo remarks can get a little tricky with stuff, especially if the tempo remark, like, let's say that this tempo remark had a broken 1500 in it, okay? This was, in this case, it would obviously change it would change the entire thing for whether it needed an alternate or not, obviously, but if your arrival was at 8 Zulu, the hour before does fall into the tempo, because it technically, well, it ends literally right at when the tempo ends, but it's up to and including basically the hour time frame in there, so it would change it to needing an alternate in this case. But the main line, or the previous from line, when you hear when we're talking about a TAF, they refer to the lines as conditional remarks and main body remarks. So the main body remarks are going to be is going to be the first line, and then any lines that start with from. Those are all considered main body language lines. And then anything that's a tempo or a prob, you don't normally see probs in US TAFs. You do see them in Canadian TAFs though. But tempo or prob, those mean conditional. And those are just supposed to exist for just when it says, not before, not after. The from line is a little bit different because it's expected to exist all the way until the next from line. And during that temporary 3-hour window in there, the wind is expected to change, but all of the previous language in that from line above it is still expected to exist all the way until 10Z. And then once that temporary remark ends, the wind is expected to revert back. It always just reverts back. It never reverts forward, if that makes sense. So your hour after would still be, so if your arrival was at 8Z, your hour before would be in the tempo remark. Your hour after would actually be the from line above the tempo remark. It's kind of just a weird one because you're going backwards for both the before and the after. So, and then the after when you're actually going even above the before. So that's the reason why I wanted to show it, just because it gets a little weird. So, and Monterey does not have any conditional language in it, so. But let's see, when in Monterey, kind of pose the question a little bit different here. In Monterey, when would be the earliest ETA that I could have that does not need an alternate? 18. So, and why 18?
Hour after.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, because 17 would fall back into the 12Z hour before. So yeah, 18Z would be the first time I really went, or if you went up, I guess you could technically say like 0Z, but yeah, even at 1Z, your hour after would be the 2Z, so anyway, but yeah, that's, any questions on the 1, 2, 3 rule? Okay. So yeah, 1 hour before, 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival, the ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport elevation, and the visibility will be at least 3 statute miles. IFR, alternate airport weather minimum. So now this part here is going to be kind of what you were asking about, Jake, but it's kind of the blanket rule for everyone unless you have an exception. So let's just read it here. IFR, alternate weather minima, unless otherwise authorized by the administrator, no person may include an alternate airport in an IFR flight plan unless appropriate weather reports or weather forecasts or a combination of them indicate that at the estimated time of arrival at the alternate airport, the ceiling and visibility at that airport will be at or above the following weather minimums. So let's just skip down to the minimums. For aircraft other than helicopters, the minimums are, for a precision approach procedure, the ceiling of 600 feet and visibility 2 statute miles. For a non-precision approach procedure, ceiling of 800 feet and visibility 2 statute miles. So everyone remembers the difference between precision and non-precision, correct? So if you're planning on a precision approach, that means you have both vertical and horizontal guidance. And non-precision is just simply your horizontal, or your lateral, I should say. So now that is not necessarily what applies to us at SkyWest, but like I said, this is kind of where it gets tricky because this is the FAR. It's 602 for a precision and 802 for a non-precision. So that's basically what it's telling us. Now later on you're going to see that we have an exception to this particular FAR. So when we look at all the FARs, the FARs are the standard rules, but a lot of airlines have in their op specs, and basically the op specs are, there's a bunch of different things that are in them. However, one of the big things that's in your op specs, and the op specs is basically a document that is created conjointly between the airline and the FAA, but it's basically the airline writes it and the FAA signs off on it. And the FAA basically will give airlines exceptions, or basically the power to go off of a different rule or to not have a specific FAR apply to them if they do certain things, as an airline, both from a training standpoint, from equipment in an airplane, kind of a bunch of different criteria. But we have, basically what I'm saying is don't necessarily worry too much about remembering those particular minimums, because later on we're going to end up looking at what the true alternate minimums are in the 121 world. So but yeah, if you don't have these particular exceptions to the rules, then those would be the minimums. So let's skip down. So takeoff minimums. For takeoff minimums, it's kind of the same deal. It has a kind of a blanket rule that everyone needs to abide by unless you have an exception. And this is also another one that we have an exception to that we'll look at a little bit later. But if we didn't have the exception, then our takeoff minimums, it's basically saying takeoff weather minimums for aircraft, and this one says for aircraft other than helicopters having 2 engines or less is 1 statute mile visibility. So those are just what we call the standard takeoff minimums. But those really, like I said, this particular FAR really doesn't apply to us ever, because we have a different exception that we can go off of that we'll look at. So kind of the same thing here. Don't really have to worry too much about this one. Let's see here. In this chart, or in this FAR as well, it gives you an RVR conversion that is good to basically have to like reference for later on. A lot of times when we're looking at weather reports, will be issued, in METARs and stuff. You'll never see RVR in a TAF, but you will see it in a METAR. And so it's good to know sometimes, like, well, what does 1600 RVR actually mean, for us? So 1600 RVR is the equivalent of a quarter mile. 2400 RVR is the equivalent of a half mile. So when you're thinking of your weather minimums, it's good to kind of know, well, what, if you're being issued RVR in a METAR, then you need to know, well, what does that RVR equate to as far as, quarter mile, half mile, three quarters, 1 mile. So just remember, 5,000 RVR is 1 mile. And the ones you'll get kind of comfortable and familiar with this later on. It's not something you need to look at and memorize now, but it'll just kind of end up being something that will be kind of ingrained later on. The next FAR here, operation specifications. Each certificate holder's operation specifications must contain the authorizations, limitations, and certain procedures under which each kind of operation, if applicable, is to be conducted, certain other procedures under which each class and size of aircraft is to be operated, and except for operation specifications paragraphs identifying authorized kinds of operations, I'll just say op specs, so everyone knows what I'm talking about here. If I say op specs, it means operation specifications. This FAR is basically telling us what that each airline has to have this document called the op specs. You'll hear me refer to the op specs a lot, just kind of, like referring to it just kind of as a general statement. Also later on in dispatch, when you're actually dispatching, you'll hear people say the op specs, for different things and all sorts of, different references basically. So the op specs, generally speaking, is a document that basically tells us what kind of things, like what kind of operations we can do, what kind of exceptions to FARs we have, it tells us what cities we can fly to, it tells us what kind of approaches we can use, it tells us what kind of instrumentation we're allowed to use. So there will be a question that you'll get asked that'll be one you'll need to know, or you'll need to be able to list. But like a question that you might get asked would be, name 5 things that you would find in an airline's operation specifications. So if you get asked that, you just need to be able to know. So like this next FAR here, 11937, says contents of air carrier certificate or operating certificate. So these are the things that must be in an op specs document. The certificate holder's name. That's pretty basic. The location of the certificate holder's principal base of operations. Certificate number. Let's see, certificate effective date, the name or designated, so the obvious stuff. And then the next FAR actually tells us a little bit more specifically what kind of stuff has to be in there. Contents of operation specifications. It must say what kind of operations we are conducting: domestic, flag, commuter, It must have the location of our principal base of operations, which would just be for SkyWest here in St. George. It'd be just the address of headquarters, essentially. Other business names under which the certificate holder may operate. So on this one, what would be some other names under which SkyWest operates? Well, that's not necessarily ExpressJet, but what would be like a DBA for SkyWest?
Oh,
I can tell you 4 of them.
Oh, like,
Yeah. Exactly. So SkyWest, DBA, Delta Connection. SkyWest, doing business as United Express. So yeah, so like SkyWest in the op specs has United Express, Delta Connection, Alaska, and American Eagle all listed in their op specs as names that we do business as. It also must list the type of aircraft we fly, and it must list every aircraft that we own and operate in the op specs. So every tail number that we have at SkyWest has to be in the op specs. Otherwise, we can't use it. So I don't know if you guys ever see those emails or not, but when we get a new plane in, when we bring up a plane from, say, Brazil, and we bring it in, we take it to a maintenance base, and then we do all the conformity checks and stuff, that plane typically usually isn't even in our op specs until after it gets into the U.S., has an actual, like, they get the registration finalized and all this stuff, but we can't use that plane for revenue service until the FAA signs that plane off and puts it in our op specs. So we have to sometimes wait around to get this email from the FAA that says, okay, aircraft 209 Sierra Yankee is now in the op specs. We can start using it tomorrow or whatever. So every airplane that we fly for revenue service has to be in our op specs. So it lists all the planes. It lists basically all the other stuff that this has in here: airport limitations, authorizations, and limitations for routes and area of operation. So it'll list basically all of the area of that we're authorized to actually fly in. So it'll list, you know, it's kind of one of those things that like lists it, like if you've ever seen like where it'll say, if it's like basically saying like the whole United States, but the way it lists it, it'll say like from 40 nautical miles offshore of California all the way up the coastline. You know, it like lists literally like the perimeter, like, you know, going all the way around to 40 miles off the eastern seaboard. Like it you know, think of it in FAA terms, like they got to literally tell you where it's at. And then it has like Alaska in there because now we fly up there. It tells us, so down here it says it's the authorization for how we control weight and balance. Any deviation and exemption granted from any requirement of this chapter. So if you think about, so that we're in Part 91, but we're looking at deviation, like the rules. So going back to these rules that we just looked at, like the IFR alternate minimums, the 1, 2, 3 rule. So this is saying any authorized deviation and exemption granted. So this is kind of what I'm referring to as basically our approval to go with a different set of rules, like not have to follow the rules that like on those alternate minimums as an example. Anyway, there's a bunch of different things that has to be in the op specs. And we're going to go through SkyWest op specs later on, and you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. A lot of it will make more sense. But the basic things that are in there, if like I said, there's tons of things you could list if you were asked this question. You just need to name like 4 or 5, but it should be really easy to name 5 things that's in the op specs. You could say, you know, a list of airports that we can fly to, a list of aircraft that we can that we operate. You could say principal base of operations, our DBA names, our exemptions from FARs. I mean, that's 5 right there. So just any 5. I think that's, I don't know if that's an ADX question or not, but.
I know with OpSpec, there is something in there. I have seen it come up. I couldn't tell you what it was right now, but I have seen it in there.
I think some of the answers are just a look at the aspect.
Yeah. Then the last thing we're looking at here, and actually, so some of this, so we started out in 91, and then these last couple of things with the op specs are actually in part 119. So I forgot to mention that we've moved into 119, but there's only just these op specs questions, and then the only other thing in 119 is there's this last one that says management personnel required for operations conducted under part 121 of this chapter. So it's basically saying if you're a 121 operator, you have to have these 5 different positions at your airline. You have to have somebody fulfilling these specific titles. So you got to remember what these are because you will be asked these. You got to be able to list these. Director of Safety, Director of Operations, Chief Pilot, Director of Maintenance, and Chief Inspector. So as long as you have those 5 people, you have to have a person for each of those, basically, is what it's saying, in order to operate under 121 rules. So just remember those 5. Obviously, at SkyWest, we have like probably 10 of each of those. So not a big deal. In a lot of cases, like the Director of Safety as an example, that number 1, we may not, at SkyWest, we may not call them the Director of Safety, but if you were to look at his title on the op specs, because in the op specs, we have to list who this person is. And so when we bring up the op specs and put it in there, we have to basically say, well, this is our Director of Safety, but sometimes it might be like a Vice President, But it'll say like Director of Operations as an example. That's going to be Tracy Gallo. So, but it'll say, Tracy Gallo. In our thing, it'll say Vice President of Flight Operations, but FAA title, Director of Operations is what it'll kind of be.
So in ours, does it have a list of like 10 chief pilots?
Well, it just has the main chief pilot. So,
Or just say Roy?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it'll just say Roy Glassy. And what's his title? Director of Flight Ops?
Yeah. No, he's Director of Flight Ops.
Tracy's Vice President.
And there's a lady who's the safety.
Yeah, well, the Director of Safety in this one is going to be Logan Phipps. So he's the one that would be like in the op specs, but it'll say Managing Director of Safety, the FAA equivalent Director of Safety or whatever. But I know it lists like, there's a lot of other people that SkyWest lists in their op specs. Like they list Anita in there for something. I don't know what, but they list Brad in there as well. And then obviously like, I think they have Bill Dykes listed in there for the maintenance stuff. Anyway, that should be it with 119. So the next stuff we jump into is going to be 121. So we can take a break here.
I said Bull Dykes for a minute.
What's that?
I said Bull Dykes.
Here we go.
Well, Chantel, you probably picked the most boring class to come to.
This is absolutely riveting.
We love bars.
Yeah, well,
So
the thing is, we've been talking about like from the beginning, like that the FARs are the worst part of like the whole 8 to 10 weeks. And so, and today's like the day we're starting it, but I promise you that it's not always like this.
Well, that's fine, yeah, like, I have a plan and like, and it's kind of neat because like, the bar 91 like comes up in some stuff that I do downstairs.
It's kind of so much better than the chair too.
Yeah, I would assume, yeah, I was thinking there's probably some stuff that you probably do see, in, downstairs and stuff, so.
I don't know anything that it means, but I see it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't personally have a problem with it, but I see like, oh, people look at it, go over it.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's, yeah, but it's just kind of one of those things where like a lot of this stuff, like even just, it's just kind of grueling to get through, but it's kind of one of those required items, those required items that it still makes you kind of rip your hair out, at
It's
least,
ridiculous. Why wouldn't they just give
at least for me.
everybody a book?
But
So it's like an open book
most
test,
of the
they don't
stuff,
tell
like
you
when
it's
we
open
get,
book.
like when we're talking, like when we do like a lot of the weather stuff, like most people usually find it, like pretty interesting. The flight planning is obviously fun. There's a few sections that are kind of like this, and some of like the system stuff kind of just is like, kind of just gotta do it type thing, but it's not really that fun to go through. But
Abbreviation,
And it's like an 8-week course, is that right? Or designed to be 8 weeks?
yeah,
It's crazy.
yeah,
how
it's
everything's going
8 weeks of material.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's like,
it has, like you can, sometimes the class may run longer than 8 weeks, but but the actual like curriculum is 8 weeks. So if it runs longer than that, and it's just spending time on other things or like reviewing things or whatever, it's basically whatever each class individually needs. So like this, like for us, we started on April 27th. We went like 4 straight weeks, but then over like the last week and a half, like we basically took like a week or so off, yeah. And now we're kind of really just starting back up this week. So it does, yeah.
4-hour classes, 1 night a week, and then Saturdays.
Saturday mornings, 4 hours. So Saturday mornings from 9 to 1, Thursday nights 5 to 9, and then the rest of the week is like usually just online like stuff. Like we have it set up on like Google Drive to like where you can just go in and you can just like look at like week 4, day 1, and they're all under separate files. But
Think about how much hours does that work? So like if you were going to assign like a number of hours per week.
if you wanted to like start and finish in like the shortest amount of time possible, you would need to basically plan on probably 25 to 30 hours a week to dedicate to it. Would you, this is the first class obviously that we've run, but what would you guys so far, would you think that how many hours a week do you think you spend doing this stuff?
During navigation, that was the rough part for me, and honestly, a lot. During weather, not so much. I mean, more, probably navigation, weather, I don't know, it's hard to say.
You should do like 3 or 4 hours after work and stuff, so probably 20 to 25.
I think that's accurate, 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I was estimating, but yeah, that's, if in the shortest, I mean, the thing is it's kind of designed to be able to kind of, to some extent, kind of go at I mean, overall, you kind of have to obviously go at a decent pace, but you don't necessarily have to go at like the full board like pace, because I mean, you can, like the quizzes and stuff, like some people are like, there's a few that are like a quiz or 2 behind, and there's, just depending on everybody's different stuff. But as far as like the teaching aspect of it, like the teaching curriculum usually will stay on schedule. And so the only part that gets a little tough is if you don't keep up with that, then sometimes, you'll have to go back and watch stuff. But let's see here. Okay. So a couple of people watching online here sent me a text. I haven't responded to. Jeff sent me a text, and Andrew sent me a text. Okay. Okay. 121. Okay, so what I'm going to just try to do with these is when I've told you like the red box stuff is the most important stuff, we're only going to really look at the highlighted and red box stuff. So, but even furthermore, when we get into the red box stuff, it's not like you need to memorize everything like word for word what it says. You just need to memorize the gist of what it's saying. So like this first box here is talking about communication facilities, domestic and flag operations. So it's basically just saying that, and we'll read it first, but then we'll just kind of get the gist of it. Each certificate holder, so when it says certificate holder, just know that that means airline. Okay, certificate holder means airline. When it says administrator, that means FAA. So each airline conducting domestic or flag operations must show that two-way radio communication, that a two-way communication system or other means of communication approved by the FAA is available over the entire route. The communications may be via direct links or approved communication link that will provide reliable and rapid communications under normal operating conditions. Each airplane and the appropriate dispatch office and between each airplane and the appropriate air traffic control unit. Except in an emergency, for all flag and domestic kinds of operations, the communication systems between each airplane and the dispatch office must be independent of any system operated by the United States. So all this is saying is that everywhere we fly to, our OCC and our airplanes must constantly be able to maintain two-way communication.
How does that work with cities that don't have like ACARs and stuff?
So with cities that don't have ACARs, so typically the only time a non-ACARS station affects us is, I mean, the only really limitation is when they're on the ground. So if they're on the ground in non-ACARS, it's expected that they're able to communicate with us by phone. So this is really kind of talking about in the air for the most part. But everywhere along a route, and anywhere, otherwise, they must always be able to maintain two-way communication between the dispatch office, the OCC, and the airplane. So in our case, even in situations where they don't even have ACARs, part of our two-way radio communications are, one is ACARs, obviously that is our primary one, is ACARs, but secondly, we also have Delta radio and AirRink radio that we can, call them on the phone. And in most of those non-ACAR stations, if we wanted to, we could call them on their cell phones, but we could also call them over like Delta radio too, for the most part, because they're still in radio frequency coverage, just not ACARs, right? So yeah, part of the one. So the only thing you really need to know here is that for a 121 flight, you must always be within two-way radio communication, whether that be via ACARs or whether that be via Delta radio or AirRink radio. Then that's fine. If you have just one of those, that's fine. Have you ever heard of either of those two radios that has Atlanta, like Delta radio or AirRink radio? So what they are is, sometimes those of you guys that have worked over there on the OCC side, sometimes you'll see, sometimes either like the shift manager or the dispatch supervisor there will get a call, and it'll be obviously we're talking to one of our aircraft that are in the air. But basically what they do, if we can't get a hold of them on ACARs, we can call this radio service, which it's called Delta Radio because it's owned and operated by Delta Airlines, but it's a service that's provided to all airlines if they want it. And AirRink is another type of that exact same thing. So there's two different services there. There's Delta Radio and AirRink. They're the same service, the same type of service, just two different companies. So we can call Delta Radio and we can say, hey, can you connect me with SkyWest 4511? Then they'll say, okay, where more or less, where is he right now? And they'll say, well, he's 20 miles west of Kansas City, at flight level 350 or whatever. Then they can basically pinpoint him on a map and see where he's at. And everywhere that we fly, the crews are supposed to monitor on one of their standby radios. They're supposed to monitor either the Delta radio frequency or the AirRink radio frequency. Now, depending on where they're flying, it might be AirRink or Delta radio. But generally speaking, Delta radio is the primary one that we use. And so they're supposed to be monitoring whatever frequency applies to that specific area for Delta radio. Then the person at Delta radio, the operator, basically gets on the airways and just calls them up on they get on there and say, SkyWest 4511, this is Delta radio, do you copy? And then they're supposed to be monitoring that. Sometimes they don't, but typically they almost always are. So then they will get in, then they basically do a phone patch with us, and we can talk to them just right from our phone, and they can hear us just over the radios in the cockpit. So that's one form of two-way communication, and as long as they're always within a frequency area for AirRink or Delta radio, then that's great, or within ACARs. ACARs is the text messaging thing. So they all have different coverage areas, coverage maps, kind of like you look at like a cell phone coverage map, they're a little bit better coverage than those, but you can see areas where ACARs does not cover them or AirRink does not cover them, but maybe Delta Radio does, or vice versa. We always have to be within one of those three coverage areas, though. And then they always obviously have to be within coverage of being able to talk to air traffic control as well. When you're on an IFR flight plan, part of the rules for IFR is that you always have to maintain contact with air traffic control. So just simply being on an IFR flight, you already have that requirement. But then furthermore, being a 121 IFR flight, you have to be able to maintain it from ATC and your OCC for the airline. So the dispatcher has to always be able to get in touch with the crew. Now, I know you guys probably see it, you know, a lot of times it looks like, oh, they're not responding, this or that or whatever, you know. So, like, obviously our primary thing is ACARS. We'll shoot over an ACARS. They don't respond. You know, 10 minutes go by. Depending on the nature of the situation, if we really need to get a hold of them, you know, if it's just something general and they're not responding, oh, he's just ignoring us or whatever. But if we really need to get a hold of them, then if they're not responding to an ACARS, then yeah, we will call Delta Radio and we'll do it. As part of dispatch training, when you're doing your desk training, you have to do like 2 or 3 Delta Radio calls just as practice. You'll call and talk to your flights just to practice and get them in, you know. And then same thing with them. If they want to get a hold of us, and I mean, it goes both ways. Obviously, it goes more them not responding to us than us not responding to them. But there's some cases where they send us a message and nobody responds. And then they end up calling us on Delta Radio. They just get on that same frequency and they call Delta Radio and tell them that they want to talk to dispatch. And then Delta Radio calls us and says, hey, I've got your flight 4511 wants to talk to you. Yeah, a lot of those situations are going to be typically if they're having some sort of a mechanical emergency or medical emergency. If they, a lot of times they'll call us and we can patch them in with like a doctor to talk about, you know, a situation with a passenger that's having a medical emergency, or sometimes they'll want to talk to maintenance. But typically the dispatcher, since the dispatcher is 50-50 joint responsibility, the dispatcher pretty much always remains on the line regardless of whoever they're talking with. So if they're doing a medical patch, the dispatcher is usually at least listening in. Or if they're talking to maintenance, especially if they're talking to maintenance, the dispatcher definitely wants to be listening in, because if maintenance tells him something that contradicts what he can actually do, you know, maintenance doesn't know the rules, and so sometimes they'll tell them stuff that doesn't necessarily jive with legality, you know, aspects, and so the dispatcher has to step in and say, we can't do that. You know, like sometimes they'll call up, they'll get into the air, and, you know, since we just went over systems, really common thing that you'll see, they'll get in the air and they'll send a message that says, or either they'll send an ACARS or they'll call on Delta Radio. Either way, they can obviously send an ACARS directly to maintenance, just like they can send them directly to crew support or us or whoever, but they'll send a message sometimes directly to maintenance that'll just say, you know, right anti-ice bleed valve, you know, caution message. And so any issue that they have that comes up in flight, they have a QRH, which is a quick reference handbook is what they call it. But if they get a message, they can quickly open up this manual and they can look up, here, boom, this is what it says to do if I get this message. It says right anti-ice bleed caution. You know, that's what the message says on their little ICAST display. And then they can look that up in the QRH, and it'll tell them in the QRH, okay, shut down that bleed valve, shut down this, and then it'll say something like, you know, do not continue into icing conditions. It'll say something like that. But they don't necessarily always go through the QRH, and then sometimes if they call up maintenance, maintenance doesn't necessarily know that there's a no icing limitation. You know, they'll just say, oh, just do this and you're fine. You should be good. You can continue flying. But they don't know that it can't continue into icing. That's the dispatcher's responsibility to tell them that. And so they give them the restriction. They give them, okay, this is the problem. Yeah, you're good to continue if you want. But then it's technically back. Once maintenance gets done talking, it's back to the PIC and the dispatcher that have to look at that and decide whether they can do this. And then that's where they see, and it's usually going to be the dispatcher that really sees, you can't, you know, the pilot may see that it says no icing, but he doesn't know if ahead of him is going to be icing. That's going to be the dispatcher that would look at that and say, no, there's no way you can keep flying to Seattle. You're going to have to fly through icing conditions, so we cannot continue turn around, go back to Denver, go, wherever, or divert to a city. So the dispatcher typically is going to be the one that makes that decision. But because of all of that, and the dispatcher almost always is going to be on the line with whatever Delta radio call, whether it be medical, whether it be maintenance, whether it be, any other particular reason. Just like with the ACARS messages, the dispatcher typically sees all of them. So all those ones that when Shelly gets on there and likes to just chat it up with crews, the dispatcher usually, sees all of those messages. And so just know as a dispatcher, you have to monitor, because if they send a message to maintenance and you don't have maintenance filtered in your ACARS, they might say something back and forth to each other that the dispatcher never even sees, that might contradict something that, that with the legality of the flight and what they're really, because sometimes the crew just assumes that the dispatcher sees it, but the dispatcher will filter any and all ACARS messages to their flight, because they need to know every bit of communication that's going on. They're, like I said, they are literally 50% responsible for that flight, just like the PIC. Even though the PIC is the one flying, and ultimately, it's him mimicking the controls of the plane, it's still, the dispatcher still has just as much say as to what happens with that flight as the captain does. So if even with, he wants, not that he wants to know, but if they're sitting there talking about, stuff like with their legality, on a crew support conversation, if they're sitting there talking about this, but they're about to fly through a line of thunderstorms, the dispatcher might think in his head, well, they might not be focused on what's ahead of them because they're arguing back and forth about their legality, and so not that you really ever see that or that they ever even intervene, but it's just that he needs to know what's going on in the cockpit. That's basically all, So two-way radio communication always has to be maintained regardless of wherever we fly. So just remember that. That's the gist of all you need to know in that. Weather reporting facilities. Each certificate holder, airline, conducting domestic or flag operations must show that enough weather reporting services are available along each route to ensure weather reports and forecasts necessary for the operation. So that's not usually a problem, because pretty much every airport and has an ASOS, and even as they're flying to their destination, they fly over several airports that have weather stations and National Weather Service offices. And anyway, that's just, it's a requirement, but it's clearly not very difficult to abide by that. Now, if you're flying, this becomes a little bit more of an issue if you are, say, flying, types of flights that we don't do, like if you're flying, transatlantic, transpacific, in those cases it's a little bit more difficult, because they have to align their route to where they know that they can get weather along the route. But for us and the type of operation SkyWest does, clearly that's not ever going to be an issue until we start doing, the really crazy stuff. Maybe, if we ever go to Hawaii or whatever. So that's all you need to know there, is that we have to have sufficient amount of weather reporting facilities along our routes that we fly. This next part is basically telling us what kind of weather reports we can use. So it's saying that no airline conducting domestic or flag operations may use any weather report to control a flight unless, for operations within the 48 contiguous United States and the District of Columbia, it was prepared by the U.S. National Weather Service or a source approved by the U.S. National Weather Service. That's basically saying all of our METARs and TAFs and any of the other reports that we get from the National Weather Service, all the TAFs we looked at earlier, those are all National Weather Service TAFs. It'll, if it is not a National Weather Service TAF, it'll say it either at the bottom or the top. There are other weather sources out there that do issue weather that are not the National Weather Service. However, if we want to be able to use those weather products, we have to get them approved in our op specs. Does that make sense? So once kind of start hearing this op specs word thrown around. So if we want to use anybody but the National Weather Service, then we have to get them approved. So we at SkyWest, I'll continue reading this first. Each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations that uses forecast to control flight movements shall use forecasts prepared from weather reports specified in paragraph B of this section and from any source approved under its system adopted pursuant to paragraph D of this section. Each airline conducting domestic or flag operations shall adopt and put into use an approved system for obtaining forecasts and reports of adverse weather phenomena such as clear air turbulence, thunderstorms, and low altitude wind shear that may affect safety of flight on each route to be flown and at each airport to be used. It's basically saying that every airline that does 121 flights needs to have their own means of saying this is how we get our weather. Even whether that, if that means that it says, all it says is we get our weather from the National Weather Service, then that's fine. It just needs to say that that's what they're using. Okay. There are various weather service providers out there that are approved by the FAA to be weather service providers that airlines can use as long as that airline pays them to use their services, right? WSI is one. SkyWest, in addition to using the National Weather Service weather, we pay WSI, and that's like, so Fusion is a WSI product. We pay WSI to be our weather provider. So we primarily use the National Weather Service. However, we do fly to some airports that the National Weather Service does not provide a TAF for. As an example, I can't even remember any off the top of my head. There's so few. It's probably less than 10 out of all of our city code list. There's like, most of them have National Weather Service TAFs, but there's a few that we have to pay WSI to provide us a TAF for every, like once a day, twice a day, depends on how often we want it. But WSI is an approved weather source by the FAA, and then in addition to that, SkyWest also uses them and pays them and lists WSI in our op specs, telling the FAA that we use WSI to obtain weather. Sometimes, I don't know if anybody's seen it, but sometimes if we have a flight going to a city that has bad weather or is forecasted to have bad weather, let's say the National Weather Service has in their TAF, it's saying that Aspen is a really common one, right, that we do this on. Aspen, the minimums to get into Aspen for our instrument approach there is an 1,100-foot ceiling and 2 3/8, or no, maybe it's more than that. It's like 2 3/4, I believe it's 2 3/4 miles visibility is what's required for our instrument approach. So going back to what I was saying about being legal to launch, if the TAF for Aspen doesn't have at least an 1,100-foot ceiling and 2 3/4 miles visibility, then we are not even legal to launch for Aspen. So I know you guys have seen the situations where we're not legal to launch, for Aspen. Now, sometimes the METAR, because Aspen, Denver to Aspen is less than an hour flight, sometimes the METAR in Aspen will actually be showing conditions that are better than what the TAF says they were supposed to be. So we, when that happens, we can call up WSI, and they basically will issue us a new TAF that has better weather in it for Aspen. Because if we went off of the National Weather Service TAF, there's situations where the TAF from the National Weather Service says that at our ETA it'll be less than what we need, so that makes us that we can't even take off at all because of the TAF. Even if the METAR, the current METAR, says that it's good weather, if the TAF doesn't have what we need in it, we still can't even launch. So, and the TAF, the thing is the TAFs, like we were saying earlier, aren't always correct. They're often wrong. So, especially with cities like, mountainous type cities like Aspen. But we can call up WSI basically, and they issue us what's called a RAM TAF, and that's basically where they issue us a TAF that is basically good enough for us to launch still. And so we can do that because WSI is an authorized weather provider for us. And then we can use that, and then we can disregard the National Weather Service TAF. So we do that a lot, especially for Aspen, but there's a lot of other places we do that for. But ultimately, this FAR is just saying that we need to use weather that is approved in our op specs, whether it be a weather vendor that's approved by the FAA or whether it be the National Weather Service. We just have to use an approved source of weather. That's all it's saying. The other thing with this FAR that kind of comes into play is that situation of when we were talking about weather observers, if you remember. So sometimes when an ASOS is out of service, we cannot get, an official approved weather source. So this is kind of what, when we were talking about the weather observer whole thing, this is kind of the reason why it exists. Even if an airport has, if we're here in St. George and we want to take off from St. George, but the ASOS is down, we can clearly visibly see that the weather is good, right? We can tell that it's VFR. If the ASOS was working, obviously it would tell us that it's 10 statute miles, whatever, that we're, good enough weather. But because it's not working, that means that we cannot get what this is asking for. We can't get an approved weather report. So that's why we have these weather observers. Weather observers are included in, they're approved by the National Weather Service. That's how they get certified. And so if we get a report from a weather observer, then it complies with this. So en route navigation facilities, that's the next one. This is just basically saying that we have to have, a conjunction of nav aids, or, we need to be within GPS coverage, or, or whatever type of navigation equipment we are using. We have to basically have appropriate and sufficient enough navigation facilities to obviously navigate our aircraft. Not usually a problem. This really applied back more when there was no GPS, like when everybody was just trying to follow VORs around, So if we didn't have enough like VORs and stuff along our routes, then it was going to be a problem. But now with GPS and RNAV routes and things like that, it's we're pretty much covered everywhere, because we can now fly, even if there's not an actual ground-based nav aid, we can still fly everywhere because we have GPS coverage and stuff like that. We just have to make sure that there's not going to be an outage, like a GPS outage, like on the RAIM, when we were talking about the RAIM checks. The RAIM check is basically something that gets done on every single flight release. It checks the route to be flown to make sure that there will not be any GPS outages. So as long as we have GPS coverage and, or a mix of GPS and nav aids and things like that, then that's basically all it's saying is we just need to have navigation equipment along our routes or available to the plane so that it's not flying blind. Makes sense, right? Dispatch centers. Each airline conducting domestic or flag operations must show that it has enough dispatch centers, OCCs, adequate for the operations to be conducted, that are located at points necessary to ensure proper operational control of each flight. So it's basically just saying that we need to have enough OCCs to safely operate our airline. I've never seen an airline that has more than just one OCC. So it's kind of leaving it up for the airline to decide what they need. But it's just saying that, we need to have enough of those, whatever we decide that it is. I don't think you'll ever see anybody have more than one dispatch center. So until they change that or make it be more, then I'm pretty sure nobody's going to add a second one. But anyway, I never seen, like I said, any necessary thing that makes it look like, that we would, like at SkyWest, that we would need more than one. We operate obviously thousands of flights, and so they all seem to be safely operated within just the one OCC. So, but that's all that's saying. That's really all that this one is saying. We need to have enough dispatch centers. So it's the only thing you need to know. Flight following system. All this one is basically saying is that we need to have some sort of a system that tells us that, that basically reports to us of, different points along the flight showing, the update of, where the flight is or where it's, currently at, that we need to be able to know at all times where our flights are and, when they're expected to be at the destination. It's basically, it's obviously, an obvious thing that you would expect, everyone would need to have, but it's basically just saying that the dispatcher, the OCC, needs to be able to flight follow all of their flights and know, all along the routes and things like that of where they're at. So simply just having, just being able to have like a system like Fusion, obviously complies with this FAR. We can see on Fusion where we're at, where each plane is at all times. But you kind of have to have multiple systems. So ACARS is another system, obviously, that counts as a flight following system. Not so much that ACARS does not show us where they're at, visually speaking, right? However, ACARS technically is the one that is reporting all of the information of the flight, like where it's at. Even though, like, when you get into like the ACARS log and look at like the all of that raw data that's in there, all of that data contains like location information, altitude information. So even though ACARS isn't necessarily used as the primary flight following system, ACARS is the one that actually sends the signal to Fusion telling it where it's at. So that information from the ACARS stuff that we can bring up in our ACARS log, a lot of those little individual reports, if you were to open them up, actually have coordinates in them. And the ACAR system, anytime it sends or transmits any data back and forth between the OCC and the air, well, all of the data flows through the OCC, obviously. And then, but every one of those reports, every single line that you can see on the ACARS report, if you were to open them up, each one of those has the coordinates of where the plane was when it sent that information. So do you remember back to the Malaysian 370 flight that just disappeared? The one of the big things that people argued about that whole flight was that, oh, well, the technology exists for us to be able to constantly monitor like where the planes are at and this and that, and we should have known where it's at. That when that happened, and they were talking about, I don't know if you can recall like all the news reports, but they kept talking about when the plane would do like the handshake, like it was talking about the little handshake transmissions that it was making between the plane and satellite coverage, the plane and, any of like the ACARS coverage. The one thing that they were talking about with that was when that happened, when the plane disappeared, the plane basically it got a lot of its systems disabled, and obviously they think that was mostly intentional, right? Because the thing disappeared from radar, and then the feed that was sending the radar is going to be like, if you're from an ATC perspective, right? That's going to be what is called your transponder that's in the plane. So somebody turned the transponder off so that it wasn't transmitting a radar signal to ATC. So that was the first thing, they lost that. But even without the transponder working, radar, so there's the two different things. There's the transponder, which will send your information to like the ATC radar, that it'll tell them the altitude, it'll tell them the speed, it'll transmit a lot of different information. But even if that was not working, radar itself, when it sends out that beam, can still pick up a plane even without a transponder. It doesn't necessarily have all of the information as if the transponder was working, but it basically, when the radar picks it up, obviously those signals still bounce off the metal surface of the plane, or even if it's composite surface like a 787, it'll still pick up that there's an object out there, and it'll send that return radar feed back, just like sonar works in water, radar works in the air. But the only difference is when you have a transponder on, your transponder talks to the radar signal, and it basically tells that signal who you are, instead of the signal having to just disseminate it for itself. Does that make sense? So when the plane went blind, or when it disappeared from radar, the first thing was that the transponder went off. Secondly, they still were able to pick up the raw radar returns. I don't know if anybody remembers them talking about the raw radar image of where it flew after the transponders got turned off. But at first they said that they were trying to follow the raw radar image, but then eventually the planes got out of radar coverage completely, where there was no radar station that was going to pick it up because it was so far out over the ocean. So they eventually even lost the raw radar return because there's not a radar station around. At that point, the only thing that was left operating that can't really, you would have to, the only thing left operating was basically that ACARS feed, right, that's in the plane. You can't turn that off unless you know which breakers to pull. You'd have to do a lot of different, and a pilot could, if somebody really intentionally wanted to disable it, they could. However, they basically say that this particular plane wasn't, no one really ever disabled the ACARS feed, but eventually the plane got outside of the ACARS coverage area, though. So it wasn't, for a while it still picked up the actual ACARS feed where it was sending the location data back to the back through their OCC. Part of it too was also that the Malaysian Air didn't really have the technology to like pick up a lot of like even what we have just even at SkyWest of picking up location data, but they still had all that ACARS data, and then they sent all that ACARS data, and that's where they were basically saying that every so often the plane, even the ACARS, was still doing what's called the handshake thing. Even though it was outside of ACARS coverage, ACARS could still send signals to like satellite coverage, and it was every so often it was doing this little handshake thing with whatever satellite was in view, and so that's kind of where they were trying to still pick up of where the plane actually ended up going, and how they figured out that it went south and down over the Indian Ocean or whatever. But long story short, obviously they never found the plane anyway. But the flight following system, the ACARS system in the plane, was still continually, even on that flight, was still continually sending the location data. It just didn't have anything other than the raw satellite feed that was able to pick it up every so often. But for our purposes here in this FAR, our ACARS is what provides all of the information, the location data. It sends it to Fusion, and Fusion will take those coordinates, put them on a map, and show us where it's at. They send it to us. So ACARS is a flight following system. Fusion is a flight following system. The usage of like the out, off, on, and in times is even considered a flight following system, because you can see the out time, then you can see when it's off. So even if you're not looking at a map, you can see, oh, it's out. Because it's not like you can see the plane on Fusion when it's. I mean, obviously in some airports you can see the ground radar and see it taxiing, but even in the airports that have ground radar, you still don't necessarily see them immediately. I'm sure you've seen a lot, and the other soups and stuff. But you still, even when it's at a gate and it pushes out of the gate and registers an out time, you'll always see the out time before you'll see the plane. So a lot of times you don't see the plane until it's out away from the terminal taxiing, right? So, but even in the places that don't have the ground radar, we rely just on the UI times, the out, off, on and in time. So to explain to you what these times, so every time a flight is operated, there's 4 times that are reported. There's the out time. I'm talking too much. My voice is going to go out on me. There's the out time, which is basically the moment that the aircraft pushes back from the gate. And then the next time that gets reported is when the plane actually leaves the ground. It registers what's called an off time. And then the next time would be an on time. It's basically when the wheels touch the ground, it reports, it sends an on time. And then once the airport or the airplane parks, sets the brake and opens the door, it reports an in time. So there's these four times that we have to gather for every single one of our flights to show that it was when it started, when it left the ground, when it landed, and when it stopped operating. So those 4 flights are required, 4 times, and then we refer to them as OOI times because it's out, off, on, and in. So OOOI. And so people will call them OOI times. But in the 121 world, you have to collect those 4 times on every single flight that's operated. And in order to, part of it is flight following, and then part of it also is just for the, the record keeping of how long was it in the air, how long, was it taxiing, how long, it's basically all that information. So that's just another way that we flight follow, is using OOI times. This next part is saying the flight following system requirements. It's basically saying whatever system we use has adequate facilities and personnel to provide information necessary for the initiation and safe conduct of each flight to the flight crew of each aircraft and the persons designated by the certificate holder to perform the function of operational control of the aircraft. And the system has a means of communication by private or available public facilities, such as telephone, telegraph, or radio, to monitor the progress of each flight with respect to its departure at the airport of origin and arrival at its destination, including intermediate stops and diversions therefrom, and maintenance or mechanical delays encountered at those points or stops. The certificate holder conducting supplemental operations must show that the personnel specified in the paragraph of this section and those it designates to perform the function of operational control of the aircraft are able to perform their required duties. So the operational control piece, the function of operational control, the only two people that have operational control over a flight is the captain and the dispatcher. So it's basically just saying that whatever system we use to flight follow has to adequately show the dispatcher, in this case, the progress of the flight. So
Would we be supplemental of mainline carriers, or supplemental refer to?
Supplemental refers to Part 135.
Okay.
So it would be charters.
Contractors.
Yeah. So yeah, when it refers in here to supplemental, it's just referring to non-scheduled service. So that's not, for us, it's not really, obviously we do charters and stuff like that occasionally, but generally speaking, supplemental is referring to Part 135 charter and non-scheduled airline service.
Are we domestic?
We are domestic. We have domestic and flag authorization, but SkyWest operates all of its flights under domestic rules. So everyone knows the difference between domestic and flag?
Really?
Okay. For some reason I thought that we count over, but we have, yeah, we definitely should. The only thing it means is domestic just means that the flight starts and ends within the contiguous 48, lower 48, basically. Flag, it just means that, so domestic is the flight begins and ends inside of the continental United States.
Flag just ended a different flag,
Starts or ends.
like a different country.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, flag, exactly. So if it starts in the U.S. and ends in Mexico, then it's a flag operation. Starts in Canada, ends in the U.S. If it, goes from flag, a different flag, to a different flag, not counting states, but countries only, then it would be a flag operation. The other types of flag operations, though, that necessarily wouldn't be the same as that. Continental United States to Alaska is a flag operation. Continental United States to Hawaii, or vice versa, are flag operations. Now that's the FAR. That's how it's defined in the FARs. However, in our op specs, we have an exemption to that FAR. So all of our operations that we do, whether they be to Mexico or to Canada or to Alaska or from any of those, are all operated under domestic operational rules. So if you don't have the exemption, obviously flying here to Mexico would be a flag operation. But we have FAA approval to treat all of our Canada and Mexico flights and all of our Alaska flights as if they were domestic operations.
So is that something that the FAA approves, despite like international influence? Like Mexico has no say in that, or Canada has no say on how we operate it? Or is it something that they would talk to them and figure out?
Well, typically, so most of the governing air authorities of different countries, are usually all on the same page. So even though the FAA is just for the United States, and then like you go to Canada and it's called Transport Canada, up there is the FAA equivalent. Those two, they're all members of like a worldwide alliance that's called IATA, the International Air Travel Alliance. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's called IATA, IATA is the international organization. So that international basically has a blanket set of rules that everyone abides by. And so they kind of have the same. Now, there are some differences, obviously, country to country, but generally speaking, most of if it's okay with the FAA, then it's going to be okay with Transport Canada. Like if the FAA okays it, then Transport Canada is going to be okay with it because their overall governing body is still the same person, even though they're different countries. So, yeah, Mexico obviously could care even less. So they really don't care much of what we do. So there are specific things that we have to abide by in addition, though, in order to get that exemption granted to us. And basically the big thing about Canada and Mexico is because most of those flights are all over land, and most of them, I mean, what's the difference really between flying Seattle to Edmonton and Seattle to Boise? I mean, other than you cross an international border, right? But generally speaking, you're over similar type of terrain. You have cities underneath you all along the route. There's really no difference other than it's just a different country. But if you had an emergency, could you still divert somewhere inland? Yes. If you had anything happened, I mean, there's really no differences other than just it's a different country. So because it's really the same, the FAA grants that exemption. Now, if we were going like way over water somewhere, they would not obviously grant, like the U.S. mainland to Hawaii would never be okayed as a domestic operation. Flag operation makes you, the alternates, like the rules are totally different. The fuel carrying rules are totally different. Everything's just totally basically changes. So but like I said, going back to the idea of, Seattle, Edmonton, Seattle, Boise, like there's no reason that we couldn't carry the same rules on those two flights. You know what I'm saying? There's no real differences that a domestic rule wouldn't be sufficient enough. So, yeah, long story short, we just do all of our operations as domestic.
Oh, we do have the certificate to do fly.
We do have it authorized, but we don't have any city pairs that are that would be considered flag. Yeah, another one too is like like when we go to the Bahamas, even that is authorized as domestic too. So obviously that one's not really that far, but I mean, if we started to fly like more down into like the Caribbean or something that's actually like logically that you could see this maybe doing, those we might have to get into flag someday down the road, but till now, even most of our stuff is all of our stuff is domestic, so. This next one on takeoff limitations, there's nothing that's a red box stuff, but it's basically just saying that you cannot take off over your max takeoff weight that's listed like in the airplane flight manual. Pretty basic. I mean, it has a ton of language in here, but
After 1959,
yeah.
I was like, really?
Yeah. Like the takeoff run must not be greater than the length of the runway.
Yes,
Yeah.
that one, I was like, really?
We're going to have to use that extra 100 yards of dirt.
Hold on just a minute.
Yeah, most of it's just obvious stuff. Next
That's
one.
disclosure.
Yeah.
Use the dirt.
Yeah, the next one is just talking about the en-route limitations. We have to plan everything with one engine in op. None of this stuff you would need to memorize, so I didn't red box any of it. But as long as you have the understanding that we do all of our planning based off of one engine in op, and you already have an understanding of like the drift down stuff. Some of it's talking about that in here. That we always assume that an engine fails at the most critical point, which is why we do drift down alternates and things like that. That's basically all these are talking about. So down to the next one here. Okay. This next one is a rule that is referred to as the 60% rule. First off, it's saying that, kind of similar to the last one, where it's saying that we can't take off at a weight higher than the max takeoff weight listed for the aircraft. Well, this one is saying that we cannot land a plane over the max landing weight of the aircraft unless it's like an emergency. And we obviously have those situations where a plane just took off and has some sort of an emergency and immediately returns to the field and lands. There's a lot of those situations where they land, obviously, I mean, they just barely took off. They're landing overweight, over the max landing weight. If you just took off at 73,000 pounds in a CRJ 700, then, and if you have a true emergency, you're not going to sit there and burn fuel and get down to 67,000 pounds. That would take a couple hours, So you're going to just land, and you're just going to land overweight. And if it's an emergency, you can do that, basically is what it's saying. But if it's not an emergency, now we've had several, like we had one the other day, an E175 took off, and it was a fully loaded E175 too, because the max takeoff weight on an E175 is 85,500 pounds, and the max landing weight is 75 or 74.5. So it was 10,000 pounds above landing weight, right? Max landing weight. It was going like Denver to Raleigh-Durham or something, somewhere far. But anyway, they had a bird strike right on takeoff, and it was a bird strike that actually hit the wheel. So it was a situation where they couldn't even put the landing gear up. So they had to, but it wasn't an emergency though either. It was just a bird strike. But because they knew that there was damage and they knew that they weren't going to be able to retract the landing gear, then it also made it so, it wasn't going to be safe to obviously continue. So they just sat there and they circled for a couple of hours and burnt off the fuel.
Really?
Yeah, because it wasn't an emergency.
Wow.
So yeah.
Oh, we're gonna
Circle.
What's safer about circling and just landing there than flying?
Well,
the altitude.
yeah, the big thing is the altitude. So if your landing gear is down, you can't go up to the altitude that you were planned at flying at, because the max altitude with the landing gear down, like on an E175, is going to be 15,000 feet. So if you're planned at 35,000 feet, then you're 20,000 feet under, and that's going to make a huge difference on your fuel burn. So basically, it would end up being a situation where even if you wanted to continue, there's going to be a lot of elements, first of all. If your landing gear is down, the plane turns into a no icing. because the landing gear is not anti-iced. So that would be one of the big things. First off, you'd have to not only show that you could go the whole route no ice, but you'd also have to show that you have enough fuel to fly it at 15,000 feet the whole way and still have all of the required amounts of fuel that you need on board, like 45 minutes reserve and all of the other things too, if it needed an alternate. So most likely, typically, first of all, they're never going to do that, even if it was a short flight. If they always just return. The other thing is, if it truly has the damage to the gear, then then there's also the possibility that they get to an outstation and the plane's going to be grounded and it'll be in a 2,000-mile road trip for maintenance. A lot of other logistical items in there. But they had to just sit there and burn off fuel for a while. Now, there is a point, too, like they do have procedures where once it gets down to a certain weight, even though it's over the landing weight, if they come in on like a really shallow angle and like at a rate of like less than like 200 feet per minute descent and land, then they can just land overweight anyway and not have to like do, because if they land overweight, they got to do a bunch of inspections, overweight landing inspections and things like that. So if they minimize it down to like the angle that they come in on and a really, low or the rate of descent is less than how many ever feet per minute, then they can, have to do less things. So, but this thing is basically saying that you can't land over the max landing weight of the airplane. And when we do all of our flight planning, we have to plan. So you know how we plan everything with one engine in op already. When we plan landing, we, as the dispatchers, are only allowed to plan to use 60% of the length of the runway that we want to land on. So it's basically saying that no person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane unless its weight on arrival, allowing for normal consumption of fuel and oil, would allow a full stop landing at the intended destination airport within 60% of the effective length of each runway described below. Then it's saying from 50 feet above the intersection. Anyway, basically just know that if we're planning on landing on a 10,000 foot runway, we technically, from the dispatch planning perspective, can only plan on being able to use 6,000 feet of that runway. So the reason for that is just that it's just precautionary, basically. It's similar to the one engine in op rule. You always are just planning for the worst situation. So it's basically just allowing that, that the plane is not planned to like land and then have to like use up like every inch of the runway in order to stop. Like you need to show that the plane can land and stop in only 60% of the whole runway. Now, that's just for the dispatcher's planning. Like, it would actually give us a weight restriction. Like when we plan as dispatchers, and it really affects us when we go into like short runway airports. Like Orange County is a really good example. Orange County's airport is only 5,700 feet. So when we land in Orange County, we only have 3,000 some odd feet to, actually not even, well, yeah, a little bit over 50, whatever 60% of 5,700 is. But we have to show that we can stop that plane in like 3,200 feet or whatever it is. Now, in most cases, that's not really a problem. Like, you'd be actually really surprised. Most of the flights that we do, and most of our airplanes, have zero problem landing within 60%. Well, obviously, we have to plan 60% at any runway that we go to. Now, when the pilot is actually doing his own numbers in the aircraft, he can use 100% of the runway. But before the flight takes off, it has to be planned to only use 60%. Once it gets in the air, they now have 100%. So from the dispatch planning perspective, if it's a situation, let's say the runway is wet, or let's say it's contaminated with snow or ice or something, all of those contaminants, and you'll see this later on too, but all of these contaminants affect that effective length, right? Obviously, if it's an icy runway, it's going to be harder to stop on than if it's dry. So if you have ice on the runway or something like that, or even just a wet runway, you have to, that 60% rule can end up causing the flight to be weight restricted. So if we're flying, like San Luis Obispo is a good one, but we'll just use the John Wayne example, the Orange County John Wayne Airport. If if we're going there, and if we, like I said, typically on a day where it's dry there, and on a day like where there's no MELs on the plane, that's going to affect the landing distance. Now there are a lot of MELs that will affect this that you'll see, like thrust reverser MELs, or you probably saw an MEL in there for the anti-skid system. The anti-skid system, if the anti-skid is MEL'd on the plane, there is no way that you could ever land, that your performance would allow you to land within 60% of like a short runway like the Orange County Airport. Like, it would not even, when you try to run your landing performance data as a dispatcher, it'll come back and it'll tell you that it's not possible, which basically means that an airplane with that MEL cannot be sent to Orange County, as an example. It has to, like, that particular MEL has to be sent to runways that are 10,000 feet or longer usually. But basically what I'm getting at, though, is that MELs, contaminations on the runway can cause a lot of weight restrictions to where you have to bump passengers off the plane before it leaves, because up until that plane gets in the air, you have to use the 60%. And even though once they get in the air, they could use 100%, and let's say the plane was going to take 70 people, if you were capable of using 100% of the runway, it could take all 70 people. But because you can only use 60 in the planning stage, you have to bump off 8 people, let's say, and rebook them. You end up going with 62 or whatever, but once it gets in the air and the pilot types in his numbers, he would have been able to still land, with 70. So, but those weight restrictions are valid because it's the pre-planning phase. You have to always base it off of 60%. When the runway is wet, you have to add an additional 15% too, or you have to account for it and like another 15%, which still has to fit within the 60%. So, I guess there's no way for me to really show it on here, but let's just say, as an example, see if my calculator will work here.
So you had essentially to plan for 45.
Well, yeah. So, yeah. Let me kind of show you. So, if you have 5,700 feet, like in Orange County, right? We have to. If we're the 60% rule means that we need to land within 3,420 feet. And like I say, normally that's not a problem. However, so what the thing will tell you when you run performance, and you'll see this like automatically because it'll pop up and you can actually see the numbers. But 3,420 would be the 60% mark. So if you are going to have to use more than 3,420, the plane will start taking a weight restriction at anything over 3,420, if that makes sense. So it will reduce the weight of the aircraft down so that it can stop within 3,420, whatever it needs to bump off weight-wise in order to stop at 3,420. Let's say that, as an example, the runway, the 100% value is 5,700, right? And the 60% value is 3,420. But let's say under a normal operation on a dry day with no MELs, let's just say that our plane is capable of stopping within, let's say that the number is actually coming back as 3,050. That's what it's, we have to stop within 3,420, but our plane can actually stop within 3,050. Like, it'll tell you the real number that the plane can stop in. So we're way under the 60% technically, so it's no problem. And typically this is how it works. Like, the 60% rule only affects us, like, it doesn't even affect us on a short runway unless that runway is contaminated with ice, snow, standing water, or if there's an MEL on the airplane, okay? Other than that, you almost never see a problem with this 60% rule. It's only when there's an MEL or a contaminated runway that you have a problem with it. So even the shortest runway I can think of that we fly to, which is this one, 5,700, might be another one out there, but this is the shortest I can think of. John Wayne, our flights to Orange County almost never take weight restrictions, primarily because Orange County is almost always good weather, and we never send a plane there that has an MEL that would otherwise restrict it. So anyway, but let's say that that number is 3,050. Now let's say that if 3,050 is what's required for us to come to a full stop, and that's just on a normal dry day, 3,420 would be the max, and we're well under that. But let's say that the runway is wet now. If the runway is being reported as wet, then we have to add an additional 15% to this number right here. Okay? So if we now add the 15%, that number now means that it's going to require 3,507 feet for us to come to a complete stop. Now we're over the 3,420, right? So the plane now, because it's over by almost 100 feet in length of the 60% rule, the plane is now going to take a weight restriction in order to get us down to a weight that will allow us to stop in the 3,420. So does that kind of make sense how that worked? It's a really confusing rule, and it, you know, like I say, the only time you ever look at the raw data really is in like this situation. You'll see it as a dispatcher, and you'll have to use it as a dispatcher, because by default, and this actually just changed like maybe 3 weeks ago that we changed this rule. Well, not a rule, but we changed the policy of how SkyWest Dispatch plans flights. We plan all of our flights with the runway wet by default. So not to say you can't switch it. You can switch it to dry in the performance. But by default, we set all of our runways to just be planned as if they were wet, so it's already accounting for the extra 15%, right? The reason we do that is because for 95% of the places we go, it's not a problem. Most of the places we go are longer runways, and even the 60% rule mixed in with an extra 15% from being wet, still even that doesn't even usually affect us. Like I said, 95% of the time. But on some of the shorter places that we go to, like for instance yesterday I dispatched, and I think out of the I had, I don't even know how many flights I did, probably 45 flights yesterday. But out of those 45, I think I had 3 or 4 of them that because of the way we changed the rule to be standard as wet, I had to go into them. And why? First of all, when it came up initially as being wet, I could see that the performance was going to give me a weight restriction. And it was, one of the places was San Luis Obispo. One of them was, I can't remember, there's a couple of them, but I've had a couple of flights to San Luis Obispo. Their runway is 5,900, I think. And so, anyway, so it gave a restriction for San Luis Obispo because of the short runway. But as long as I can go into the NOTAMs and the weather and verify that that runway really is dry, I can switch it to dry. And by switching it to dry, it's given me back the 15%. So at SkyWest, with the way we started to see things, like there's less times that you have to switch it from wet to dry. It accounts for a less amount of flights than it is from switching it from dry to wet. So we changed the default to just be wet because 95% of our flights, even if it's really dry, can still land perfectly fine, no weight restriction, even if it was wet. So we just keep the default to wet just to be more restrictive. And then if it is causing a weight restriction, then we can go in and look at it, and as long as we can verify that there's no NOTAMs saying that the runway's wet, then we can switch it to dry. So we have to do that on less flights than we would do if it were the other way around. So anyway, long story short, that's why we switched it, but that's how that rule works. And like I said, once the airplane gets into the air, when the captain or first officer, when they actually run their real landing numbers, they get 100% use of the runway. So even in a situation where we have an anti-skid MEL, once they get up in the air, even with an anti-skid MEL on a wet runway, they still don't take a weight restriction, whereas when the dispatcher planned it, it took sometimes a weight restriction that would have been enough that it couldn't even say that it could land at all. So anyway, that's how that works. That's the 60% rule. Just need to kind of just know. The only thing you need to know if asked is that all of our flights, or all flights from a dispatcher perspective, have to be planned to land within 60% of the effective length of the runway. That's really all you need to know. And that's turbojet planes. If this were a propeller plane, which in case you get asked, prop planes can use 70%. So, but we don't have Brazilias anymore. So, but if you're asked, like in your practical or any other environment, for group 1 aircraft is 70%, group 2 aircraft is 60%. So basically, group 1 prop, group 2 is turbojet. So. You can see that in the next column there. Actually, it's not in the red box, but paragraph C, turbo propeller powered airplane that would be prohibited from taking off a full stop landing within 70%, right there. Okay, no person may list an alternate airport as an alternate airport in a dispatcher flight release for a turbine engine powered airplane. This is the same thing as that previous rule. This is just telling us that it also applies to the alternate. Okay, so it's part of the dispatch planning as well. Obviously, if you are listing an alternate for your flight, we can only plan to use 60% of the runway at the alternate. All the other same things, it's just that it applies to the alternate as well. I'm just going to scroll and go past, unless it's red boxed, I'm not going to go over it just for time constraint. Okay, dispatcher qualifications. It's basically just saying that no airline can use a dispatcher or have a person act as a dispatcher for their airline or a particular airplane group unless that person has successfully completed initial dispatcher training and also operating familiarization consisting of at least 5 hours observing operations under this part from the flight deck. So this is basically just saying when you initially get hired as a dispatcher, you have to go through initial dispatcher training at any given airline that you go to. So even if you have been at another airline previous and you go to work for a new airline, you then, once you started the new airline, you have to go through their initial dispatcher training for their stuff. So anytime you switch jobs as a dispatcher, or switch airlines, I should say, you always have to start fresh, basically, and go through all of the initial dispatcher training. So in addition to that, you also have to go through your jump seating, that's what this operating familiarization is referring to. Once you get done with your dispatcher training, before you can actually dispatch flights, you got to go out and do your jump seating. And your jump seating is 5 hours of sitting in the jump seat, flying around with crews, and just observing how they operate and just, how they do things, talking to them, shooting the breeze, just having fun, whatever. And basically log 5 hours in the jump seat. And then once you're done with that, you are officially signed off. Well, you got to do your comp check, and it basically goes like this. Your initial ground school, which is your initial dispatcher training. Then you do all of your desk training, which is all part of the initial dispatcher training. But you do ground school, which is like 2 weeks, and then you do all your desk training, which can be anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks, depending on the person and depending on their level of experience. But after you do that, then you do your comp check. And then after you've passed your comp check, the last thing would be that you go out and you got to do your 5 hours jump seating. And then once you're done with your jump seating, then you're signed off as a dispatcher. You can come back and do your own flights, work the desk. When you initially do your jump seating, the very first time you do it, you've got to do all 5 hours. You technically are supposed to do 5 hours per year, because every year after your first year, you then still have to you got to do 16 hours per year of recurrent training. And so we basically have 2 recurrent classes, 2 8-hour recurrent classes every year. They just call them day 1 recurrent, day 2 recurrent, usually one in the spring, one in the fall. But also every year you got to redo your 5 hours of jump seating every single year too. However, if it's anything after your first year, if it's a subsequent year, you can actually reduce the jump seat hours down to 2.5 by doing subsequent takeoff and landing. So if you were to do, you either need to do, it's basically saying you need to do 5 hours. The very first time you do it, you got to do all 5 hours no matter what. Regardless of how many flights that takes you, you got to do 5 hours, period. Any year after that, when you're renewing your yearly renewal, basically, you can go down to 2.5, but you have to add like an extra flight in order to get down the hours. So for every flight you have, you can reduce 1 hour off of the total. So basically the best you could do is get down to 2.5, but even by doing 2.5, you would still need 3 total flights. You'd have to take off and land 3 times, is basically is what it says. So the best you'd really ever be able to do is like, I've never seen anybody do less than 3 hours, because you kind of really can't find any flights that are a half hour. Most of our flights are usually at least an hour in block, even the shortest ones. So If you did like just 3 1-hour flights, you would be done essentially, because you have 3 flights, which means you can take off. You could take off 2.5 hours, because you can only go down to 2.5 minimum. So the best you can do is get down to 2.5, which would still mean you needed 3 total flights. So if you just, like a lot of people, I think the best I've ever done is this last time I did St. George, Salt Lake for my first flight, and then I did Salt Lake, Sun Valley, Salt Lake. So I had it done basically. I still think I had 3 hours and 6 minutes, which I think was the best that I ever did. But basically all I'm saying is you can, as long as you have subsequent flights, you can reduce the hours, except for the first year. You got to do all 5.
So on that jump seating, does it have to be with the airline you work for? Can it be any airline?
It's got to be with the airline you work for. It's got to be in the group of airplanes that you dispatch. So for instance, back when we had Brazilias, because Brasilia is considered a Group 1 aircraft, and obviously the CRJ and the E-175s are considered Group 2. You have to do 5 hours of jump seating, or you have to jump seat every year in a type of airplane that you dispatch in each group. So now that the Brazilias are gone, when you do your Group 2 jump seating, you can do it on either the 175 or the CRJ. You'd only have to do it once though. You don't have to do both the CRJ and the ERJ.
Is there something that you have to declare you're doing your observations, or can you just jump seat one day and then?
If you just happen to be needing to sit in the jump seat because you're commuting, and it's one of our flights, then you can just count it.
Okay.
Yeah, I do that all the time. Yeah. In fact, even if you don't even keep the paper, because you technically take around a little form that just logs the flights, but when you sit in the jump seat, you're given like the flight coupon. I know you've seen it. It's just the 1P seat, right? As long as you just even keep that, and then you just attach it to your form, that would even count, because they can see physically that you got the jump seat issued, you know. But yeah, if you're commuting around, like there's been several times like where, you know, I've been just traveling with my family, like Chicago, Salt Lake, or whatever, and I ended up having to sit in the jump seat to make the plane, you know. My wife and kids got the back, and the only spot left for me was to sit in the jump, but it happened to be our flight. And so I got 3 hours right there. But because it was only one flight, I still needed to do at least one more. Because if you only end up doing one flight, it will have to be all 5 hours. But we don't have any 5-hour flights, obviously. So no matter what with SkyWest, you got to do at least 2 flights to even make 4 hours. So, but if you're cruising around, just on a trip or whatever, you end up in the jump seat and it is a SkyWest flight, then yeah, you can count it. The only limitation there is that one of the flights has to be, because you have your annual renewal month, basically. And like for me, it's January of every year is my renewal month. But you have to do one of those legs within 60 days of your renewal month. So I did mine one time, but I had more than 5 hours, in fact, because I ended up in the jump seat on the Chicago Salt Lake, and then I ended up on the jump seat in a Salt Lake Dallas flight. So I had like 6 hours just right there between 2 flights, but neither of them were within 60 days. So I had 6 hours already in the jump seat, but I still had to go out and do one last leg to make it within the 60 days. So it's just stupid little things, but.
For SkyWest, you know, like after the initial training, do you have a set amount of time you have to do the jump seating it by? Like, do they give you like, you have the same day?
So when you do your comp check, when you pass your comp check, they schedule your jump seating for basically the next 3 days.
Okay.
So they give you the next 3 days off, but you're supposed to complete your jump seating in those 3 days. You also just, you can go tell them, if you want to, you can tell them what flights you want to do, and as long as you go talk to like the CSC person or our admin, who's Sydney on the other, I don't know if you know Sydney on the other side, but she, if you're doing your jump seating, then you get S1 privileges. So if you end up going out and then, because pilots can still bump us out of the jump seat, even if we're doing our jump seating, they still can bump us out. So if we get bumped out of the jump seat for whatever reason, then we're still S1 on the flight. So we still at least make the flight as an S1. So just to protect us. And then you get paid 12 hours of OT to go do it, and then they pay per diem for the day too.
That's nice.
Yeah, so if you plan it like as part of a vacation or something, that you're going somewhere, then you're basically getting, if you jump seat out to somewhere, then you're going to get 12 hours of OT that day paid for you. Like I did one where I got, it had holiday pay and then like OT pay, like the jump seat pay, like all on like the
Did you
same.
change the tax bracket on that check?
Mine is 99 permanently. I seriously, I did 99 all of last year and I still got a refund.
Really?
Yeah, because of my situation from last year. Yeah, because I added 2 dependents, built a house. I mean, like I had like every freaking deduction you can think of last year. So yeah, I was fine. In fact, my thing tells me just to keep it on 99 for the year. So my wife wasn't working. I mean, it was the one, everything you can think of that like limits or that adds deductions. Like no wife working. I'm the only job. I'm like got added kids and added a house and this and that. Anyway, but yeah, no, I had like 12 hours of jump seating going out, and then I had like holiday pay in there, and worked out pretty nice. So that's the jump seating deal. But because we have to do that, one of the biggest perks of being a dispatcher is that you get to be put into the CAS system. So because we can jump seat, you can then go to any airline, any flight, and request to sit in the jump seat of any airplane, U.S.-wise, domestic flight, I should say. And as long as, somebody else isn't sitting in it or needs it, or sometimes there's a lot of airplanes that have 2 and some airplanes that have 3 jump seats, but you can sit in the cockpit of any airplane, of any airline in the United States and, get around where you need to go. When I first started dispatching, I worked for Great Lakes out in Cheyenne. And for the first 2 airlines I worked for, Great Lakes and then ExpressJet, I never ever lived. I lived in Salt Lake the whole time, all the way until I started working for SkyWest. So the first 7.5 years that I worked in the airlines, I commuted basically. And the whole time I did that, I jump sat pretty much, weekly to and from work. So I was always jump seating Salt Lake, Denver, on like Frontier, on SkyWest, on anybody who flies the route, obviously. And then when I did Atlanta, like constantly was on the Salt Lake Atlanta flights, 767s, 757s, just all over the place. A couple of years ago, I had to sit in the jump seat. Me and my wife went on a cruise, and I ended up sitting in the jump seat on the red eye, Salt Lake, all the way to Charlotte. And then we got into Charlotte, like 5 a.m., and then sat in the next jump seat from Charlotte to San Juan, Puerto Rico. It was a unpleasant experience. Because my wife got first class on both flights. So the thing is, it wasn't so much that the jump.
Like, hey, you're out.
The thing about it wasn't that the jump seat was so bad. The jump seat part of, because both of the flights were on Airbus A321s, and that's actually like the nicest jump seat you'll ever sit in. It's not like it's better than first class by any means. But first of all, it is cool to sit in the jump seat because you're up there, you can see everything they're doing, you can see out, you can watching them land. I mean, that part of it is cool. Like even if you've been dispatching, I've been dispatching for over 10 years, and I still love sitting in the jump seat. I don't necessarily prefer it. You know, like when you're a new dispatcher, sometimes you actually prefer it because it's so new and exciting and fun. Even in the CRJs, which is like the worst jump seat. You know, just the type. Well, you guys saw it. Some of you sat in it. It's horrible, especially for a bigger guy. You know, so. But even that jump seat was still fun to sit in. You know, I mean, it's better to me. Any jump seat is better than a middle seat. You know, so take that for what it's worth. Unless you're sitting next to two of your kids. So, but yeah, the thing was that sucked about that trip was that the flight looked like we were both going to easily get first class. And so you kind of have that mindset, yeah, we're both getting first class. It's going to be awesome. We're going on a cruise, you know. And then we literally checked in, got to the, you know, even at the ticket counter, I was asking the guy, it was a U.S. Air flight. And so you know how when we had U.S. Air benefits before it switched to American, how like they didn't upgrade people to first class. You could almost, if it had first class, you pretty much were going to get it, you know. So even down at the ticket counter checking our bags, the guy's like, oh yeah, you guys are definitely both getting first class. And then there was 2 seats left, but we were 1 and 2 on the list, and there was nobody, they didn't do upgrades. Even the dude at the ticket counter is thinking, oh yeah, they're pretty much yours. Count on it, you know. Might as well sign them right now, is what he said, but I can't. So in the time that we freaking checked the bags and walked to the gate, some idiot from another flight walked up to the gate agent and bought a first class seat. Yeah. So when I travel, unless it's like a situation where I can't jump seat, like the first time I ever did not take jump seat clothing in my carry-on was this last trip. And that's just because I physically could not jump seat. Like just the aspect of like, because we had 2 lap children, like there's no way that I could have jump sat, right? Because you can't hold 2 lap children and you can't give one of them to a 5-year-old. So there's no way that I was going to be able to sit in the jump seat even if I had to, right? So I didn't, that was the first trip ever though that I didn't take them with me. But I always take them, even if the flight's wide open, like you'd be surprised like the amount of times like the jump seat just like saved your ass, basically. But anyway, yeah, so ended up sitting in the jump seat. The Airbus, most Airbus have 2 jump seats, which is really nice. But then the same exact thing. So that was a red eye, Salt Lake to Charlotte, and then we got into Charlotte. And then the whole time on that flight, though, I was thinking, man, like I was so pissed because I got screwed by whoever bought that ticket. Because I would, you know, when you're planning on first class, you have that mentality of like, you know, it's just such a letdown when you don't get it, you know. But I was thinking that the only saving grace to all this is the flight from Charlotte to San Juan was wide open. Like it had 20 first class seats open. So no problem, right? And it was like the exact same story. Like some other Charlotte San Juan flight before it ended up getting delayed. They rebooked everybody onto that flight, ended up filling up every first class seat except one left. My wife got it. There was even another person in the jump seat, and it was an FAA inspector. And so I got the last seat, and I had to fight some cargo airline employee for it. And the only reason I got it over him is because SkyWest was a U.S. Airways Express carrier, so I bumped him out of the jump seat, basically, because he was just a cargo guy, unaffiliated with U.S. Air. So I barely got on that flight in the jump seat, too, so it just sucked. But anyway, it saves you.
Usually jump seat clothes, you have to dress up.
Just, yeah, business cash. So, yeah, I mean, if you're, you know, basically like SkyWest, you know, for a dispatcher, because, you know, since we don't have uniforms or anything, it's just collared shirt and then just dress pants. They say no jeans, even though there's been a lot of times, back when I used to teach at Salt Lake Community College, when I would have to fly, I mean, you guys know how bad the Salt Lake St. George flights can be, so a lot of times I ended up in the jump seat on that flight, but there were a lot of times where, like, I had made the list, like, I was well within the people who were going to get a seat, but there were still several people that were not going to get a seat, like some of the S3Bs and stuff. And so a few times they would ask me to take the jump seat to get another person on, and in that case, like if I had jeans on, they didn't care, just because I was doing them a favor, and I had a seat otherwise, you know. So, but generally speaking, yeah, it's you need it. So, guess we'll end with that. So, big thing is just continue to go over these. The rest of these that are encircled in the red box. We'll continue hitting these up on Saturday too. So
the actual, like, 121 point whatever, just, you know,
no, you don't even need to know that. Yeah, I wouldn't even know any of these based on the actual FAR number. Just what, if somebody were to say, how many hours of jump seating do you need per year? Just that kind of stuff. How much, just basically what I said you need to know the gist of.
are you guys, yeah?